Morning, everyone. We have Brother Jonathan Maria today talking to us about God's role in the family, and he's going to he would like to bring in some snippets of the saints themselves that were the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux. So he's going to use that as well. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise them. And then our next speaker will be February 3rd, and that information will be in the bulletin. That will be Brother Joseph Teresa talking about worshiping versus honoring, how we don't worship saints, we honor saints, and we pray with the saints to the saints. So, Brother.
Okay, yeah, so hi. I'm Brother Jonathan Maria. I'm one of the brothers in temporary vows up at Holy Hill. And yeah, we're going to talk about God's role in the family. I called it a church at home. And it works wonderful. The first part of it will be something of a doctrinal part, because, when I ask myself, God's role in the family, how do I go about that? I figured that I will have to talk about kind of in general, what is the family supposed to be from the church's point of view and from God's point of view, I guess. So we can see where does God figure into that. And then the next part, if you're worried about the challenge, that we'll get to it. It'll be a little bit of a chance maybe to both raise some questions, but also to look at a challenging quote from scripture that many find troublesome to interpret. And then we'll have the example part that Bernadette mentioned, that we'll look at Saints Louis and Zélie, the parents of Therese. And then a different kind of example will be a little bit about my own family's example. And it's maybe less ideal than Saints Louis and Zélie. So, the family. When we talk about the family, we have first of all kind of have to understand what is the family. And I think in today's world, that's probably one of the most controversial topics. What is the family? I think maybe to many of us here, it will seem fairly obvious what the family is, yet it's very contested. But the Catechism of the Catholic Church, referred to as CCC, says that a man and woman united in marriage, together with their children, is a family. I don't think any of us are surprised by that definition. Maybe it doesn't even, hopefully it doesn't strike us as controversial while we're here, but it is a definition of marriage that we see being challenged very much today. There are all, I think it's called sometimes alternative family structures or whatever the names for it might be, but as the Catechism goes on to say, marriage is not a human institution. God himself is the author of marriage. The reason why this is very significant is that marriage does not exist by virtue of a human decision. We did not decide that we wanted marriage to be a thing in society. We did not give it its definition and then its boundaries, what is marriage and what is it not. God himself chose marriage for humankind. So we don't get to change it. And this is also, so because God meant for humankind to be married, it kind of belongs to what's proper to human nature. The Catechism goes on to say that God, who created man out of love, calls man to love, and this is the innate vocation of every human being, meaning every human being, whatever the challenges they might have or circumstances they might live in, are called to love. For more on the vocation in general, you can go online and watch a previous talk that was given on that subject. But it does mean that, well, first of all, let me just take it back. It does mean that marriage, apart from just being something God has given to us and something that's proper to human nature, it's also a way to live out this universal vocation to love. You will learn to love, you will grow in love, and you will share love through the following of this vocation. Marriage is what we would call a personal vocation. It's something that the individual is called to, but it's a way to participate in the vocation we all share, which is love. Marriage is very important because, as the Catechism says here, man and woman's mutual love becomes an image of the absolute love with which God loves mankind. The word image is fairly important here because an image is not quite the same as being the same thing. If we have a picture or an image of a person, we wouldn't say that that's just as good as having the person themselves here. But what this points to is that when we're living in this world, on this side of death, then the most direct image we have, what shows us who is God, what is God, is the family unit. The family is the most direct image we have into what is the nature of God. That means it has immense importance. Married life and the family means a lot in not just the formation of the individual, but even our understanding of God. Who is God will be either proclaimed to us truthfully, or it will be obscured somewhat by our family and by the family we see around us. It is good, and it's very good. The Catechism goes on to emphasize it is very good. There's nothing bad about marriage. We see many people struggling with it. We see many attempts at marriage that don't succeed. And it's not because marriage itself is bad, but it's because there are a lot of struggles that we have to overcome ourselves. And the Catechism says elsewhere that all of these struggles do not arise from something being wrong with marriage. It's not that there's something like it's not, God hasn't instituted some kind of union between man and woman that's meant to fail. That's not what God did. And it does not arise from human nature either. So I did say marriage is meant for human nature, but all these struggles that we encounter in marriage is not something that flows because of what we are. It's a direct result of sin. And that's important to keep in mind too, that all of these challenges and struggles that there are in marriage is not something that's supposed to be there in a sense. It's something that arrives because we are not perfect and we have our weaknesses. This is another point. So if marriage is the image of God's absolute love, it follows, and the church also underlines this, that it can never be dissolved. If we go back and say, okay, if marriage is an image of God's love, what would that image say about God's love if it ceased to be? This is another way of saying that divorce is not a thing in the church. It always just says that some people choose to be civilly divorced. It says civilly divorced because there's no such thing as divorce in the language of the church. It doesn't exist because that would be saying that indirectly you would be saying that maybe there's a possibility that God will take back his love for us. And he doesn't. But it's very important to understand why is it that marriage can't be dissolved? Why is it that divorce is not a thing in the church? It is because it bears directly upon our understanding and flows directly from who God is. This is another important one. The church does not have the power to contravene this disposition of divine wisdom. It's very fancy language, but it basically just means the church cannot say, okay, now divorce is okay, we can separate this union. It's taken directly from Scripture when Jesus himself says, what God has united, man cannot tear apart or asunder, or whatever translation we might use. So because God has brought together two human beings to be an image of who he is, and he's the one who's instituted the marriage, both in general and in particular, the church has no authority to say this marriage does not exist anymore. To make a little point about what is when a marriage is annulled, to make that clear as well, what the church says in that case is that this marriage has never existed. It may seem like it's a very fine point, but an annulment says this marriage was never valid from the beginning, and therefore these two people have never entered into a marital bond, and therefore they can legitimately separate. There is a whole discussion on that we'll leave aside for now, but I just wanted to make clear what does the church actually say when it annuls a marriage. Okay. So before we go on to this, I do want to mention that I've talked about how, yes, it's an image, the family is an image of God's love, but in many ways it's not just an image, it does make God present in the world, but not in the same way, for instance, Mass does. When we're here at Mass and we participate in the liturgy, Christ is made present physically, spiritually, full divinity. He is here as he is. He's right in there in the tabernacle. But the family unit does make God present in a different way. And it's hard to come up with a better analogy than image, but it's important to understand that it's much more than an image. So, I don't know what we could compare it to really. Maybe FaceTime or something like Skype, but that doesn't really convey it either. But there is truly a presence of God in the family. And when we go to this quote, the Christian family is called a domestic church. And it says it is called so because it manifests and lives out the communal and familial nature of the church as the family of God. So the church is a place essentially where God is. God is present in his church. As I said, he's right in there. But Jesus himself also says, where 2 or 3 people are gathered in my name, I am there among them, or I am present among them. But we do know that that presence he's talking about there is not the same as his Eucharistic presence, his presence in the Mass. So it's in the coming together of the family that Christ is somehow made present. And it is kind of mysterious. It's in a spiritual sense, but no less real. But the thing about this, I call this the role of Christ's priesthood in the family. The family unit does not only make God present like themselves, the whole family unit is also, is also taken up into God. The Catechism in another quote says that the love in the family becomes assumed into the divine love. And that makes good sense if we think again, if the family is an image of God's love, of who God is, there has to be some kind of resemblance. So there is a real element of divine love present in the family. So there's kind of two movements going on in the family. There's one that is kind of, we can say, from heaven down, but heaven to earth, which is the family kind of brings God into our world and shows who is God, what is God like. For us in religious, for me and my brothers in religious life, we, in an ideal world, we would look to the family unit to be reminded of what is it that we're aiming for in heaven. And the family unit would look to those of us in religious life or consecrated virginity, celibacy, and say, what is it that we're looking forward to? And we have to remember that even though we're making God present now, he's going to be more present in the next life. So it's kind of two different aspects of life in church that tells something about who God is to each other. So the way the family is kind of assumed into God is very mysterious, but no more mysterious than the way I would be in this life. And it's because each family member, it says in accord with their own role, will exercise the baptismal priesthood, and then it contributes toward making the family a community of grace and prayer. And this is taken from the compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's a much shorter version of the Catechism, but excellent tool if you're looking for a way to just kind of look up what does the church actually say on this without having to sit down with 800 pages and try to figure it out. Okay, but what does that mean? And why is this the way that the family is taken up into God? The baptismal priesthood, I think often we don't think about what is the baptismal priesthood, what does it actually do? As the name indicates, you're granted the baptismal priesthood when you're baptized. Okay, so how does this priesthood work? How is it different from the priesthood of, for instance, Father Jude or any other ordained priest? The difference is the baptismal priesthood, you're granted that because you're made a child of God and you're made a member of the body of Christ. And Christ is the high priest. So somehow you partake in the priesthood. But what you're capable of doing as a baptized Christian and how you exercise this priesthood is that whatever it might be in your own life, whatever struggles you have or even good things, you are capable now of making that a sacrifice to God. So you can give that up to God. You can unite your own life with God's life. But in baptism and in the baptismal priesthood, you're offering your own life and you're doing it in your own name. This might sound like, what does that even mean? But it does mean that when you go to the Mass, and we're getting closer and closer to the Eucharist, there should be, ideally, at least, if not before Mass, at least during Mass, where you reflect on maybe the week that has gone by, and the good things that have happened, and the bad things, and then you just make an offering of those things. You give it to God, you give it to Christ, and ask that He will take those sacrifices, and He'll unite it with His own, and then present it to God. Church has this quote, and this goes for all the laity, but it's works, prayers, apostolic undertakings, the family itself and married life, daily work, relaxation of mind and body, if they are accomplished in the Spirit, and then even the hardships of life, if patiently borne. All these become spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. This is a much shorter way of just saying what I just said. But the ordained priesthood, to make that clear, when Father Jude is saying the Mass, giving the sacrifice of Mass, he's not sacrificing anything in his own name, at least not in the liturgy. He might be in his own spiritual life, but the sacrifice he's offering is the sacrifice of Christ. And Father Jude, in his own person, is making that sacrifice in the name of Christ. So the ordained priesthood, you get to act as Jesus himself. Baptismal priesthood, you get to act as yourself in accordance with Jesus. It's a big difference, but it's important to understand what is this priesthood, because the baptismal priesthood is how we all participate in the life of Christ. The family too. But the family, because as you can see, family and married life is mentioned by itself. That is its own way of participating in the priesthood. That's also why it says here that parents have a special way of participating in the office of sanctifying. And it goes on to say how they do that. But this office of sanctifying, it can be, what is that? But it's something that's proper to the priesthood of Christ. Because if we ask, how do we become holy? Where does holiness come from? Then hopefully it's very clear that it comes from Christ. We can't become holy by ourselves. We can't aim at it ourselves, and somehow, if we just put in the hours, we'll become holy someday. That's not how it works. Maybe some would wish that it did work that way, but it doesn't. And so this office of sanctifying is something that, you could just say it's the office of priesthood, but it is meant for the sanctification of other people. The thing about priesthood, for instance, when you're ordained a priest, that grace that's conferred upon the man who receives the priesthood does nothing to make him holy immediately. That means when you're baptized, for instance, you become a child of God. That does something immediately for you to become more holy. When you receive confirmation, you're anointed with the Holy Spirit, you immediately become more holy. There's a grace that's given that works immediately in your own life. And the same when you receive the Eucharist, you're united with Christ. It has the immediate effect of sanctifying you. It's not wrong to imagine ourselves as living tabernacles when we receive the Eucharist, because Christ is truly present, body, soul, and divinity. But priesthood and matrimony, the sacrament of marriage, does not confer an immediate grace upon the recipient, but it confers a grace for the sanctifications of other people through the recipient. For the parents, that means specifically in their upbringing of the children. It mentioned before in the quote in the middle, in accord with their own role. Parents and children do not have the same role in the family life. That makes good sense if we think about it. It would be very awkward if the children suddenly started to say, like, all right, here's what's for dinner, and then, go to bed now. You've been up all day, so Dad, you have to go to bed now, and then, I'll watch TV or whatever. We know that wouldn't work. There is some kind of hierarchy in the family. But this too is what makes it very clear how, even though there are these roles, everyone participates in the priesthood of Christ. The children have an obligation. Maybe many parents are glad to hear this, but they do have an obligation as children to be obedient to their parents, to not resist instruction when it is given. And I think if all of you who have kids will know, yeah, okay, sure, that's very ideal. It is very ideal, but that is what's kind of proper to children. We know, again, if we have children that are kind of dominating their parents somehow, we kind of know that's not right. That's not how it's supposed to be. But the children, by doing that, participate in Christ's own obedience. Because it says right there in Scripture, after Jesus is found in the temple, that he went home with Joseph and Mary and was obedient to them. It's kind of crazy to think about that when God becomes man, he is God himself. He has every right to command Mary and Joseph. He is obedient. And is also, we see further on, when Paul writes about Jesus' obedience, he says he became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. And so we see how far does that obedience go. It goes all the way. It's not like children are just obedient in one aspect or one time of their life, but they do owe some kind of, at one point they do set out on their own path and start their own lives, but they do owe some kind of reverential obedience to their parents throughout their whole lives. And we kind of get that from the Old Testament with the covenant, honor your father and mother, which we see Jesus make a big point out of later. The Pharisees at one point ask him, why don't your disciples follow the customs of the fathers, of what's been handed down by our forefathers? And he retorts with, why don't you follow the divine law that's been given to you? And then he mentions exactly that commandment. You don't honor your father and mother. The parents, in this role of sanctifying and in this kind of shepherding their children in a sense, that's probably a foreign image to how we think of a family unit, and probably not one that should be taken literal in any sense. But in their duty as this kind of, they teach their children how to become Christian. What does it mean to be Christian? They take on in this very real sense, in special way, the office of sanctifying, which is proper to Jesus, but they participate in it. It's very clear if we think about that parents are the ones who will teach their children how to pray. And Jesus is the one who taught the disciples how to pray. So, and I would follow Jesus' example in that and teach your children the Our Father for sure, and kind of the meaning of it, the value of it. But we see very clearly that every single member of the family, in their own way, participates in the priesthood of Christ and in the life of Christ. And so that's how every member and the family as a whole is brought into God. I hope it's, let me make it somewhat clear. Come on. The spirit is willing, but come on. Good, we're back. Yes, so this is I mentioned that there are two sacraments that don't confer an immediate grace, and this is exactly it. It confers a mission. And it's very interesting to see here that matrimony says it confers a mission for the building up of the people of God. This is another aspect that's very important to understand, that the family unit, the Christian family, does not exist just for itself. It is an active community within the church at large. And so the family has this kind of duty, almost obligation, by virtue of the grace given in matrimony, to be a source of Christian unity in general. And I think this is where it can get very difficult to follow this mission, because you could argue that, yeah, there is a case, for instance, that if you have a very strong, healthy family, then there's a duty and obligation to share that family bond with those who do not. Are there members of the parish who are very alone, who maybe don't have a family, especially around Christmas time or even Easter as well? Are there members of the parish that do not have a place to go? Well, as a Christian family, there could be a duty then to open up the family and invite them. Of course, prudence has to be taken. Care for your own family does have a precedence. But if everything's kind of, well, we have space, we have food, the children are not in danger in any way. I mean, don't invite some stranger in who might do God knows what. But there is this obligation and duty to take care of those people, our Christian brothers and sisters, who maybe don't have that same family bond. There are many people who have become members of the church at the cost of their own family, or when their family has kind of shunned them, say, oh, we want nothing to do with you then, because you've chosen this path. It's very important that those people see that by becoming Catholic, they've received a new family. And that's not the primary task of the priest, but of the families that are within the church. So there is a mission that extends to the whole church as a married family. It does not mean that you necessarily, there's a lot of discernment that goes into it. It's not a very clear-cut case, because parents, for instance, do have their first responsibility to their own children. So it's a lot of discernment goes into it, and it's kind of figuring out, can we do this as a family? Do we have that space? And if not, then how do we get there? And then, as I've talked a lot about the priesthood, the ultimate act of Christ's priesthood is his death on the cross. And as it says here, all Christian life comes from the cross, and it's no different for families. The grace, because we're never given a mission. That's another thing that's important to say. We're never ever given a mission by God without the necessary grace to fulfill it. So God doesn't put a burden on you and say, like, all right, go ahead, do it. And then just leaves you there and kind of like, what am I supposed to do this? This is way too heavy. I could never do this. And so the grace of Christian marriage is this, there are many layers to it, because one, there's the grace to extend outwards, to reach out to other Christians. But there's also the grace for the partners, the spouses, to sacrifice themselves for each other, which is kind of at the heart of the mystery of the cross, is the sacrificial love that spouses will have to exercise towards each other. We'll get into that a little later. Maybe even now. Let me just see my notes. Okay, but yes, it's important to just remember that this grace essentially means you're never alone in this. It might sound obvious when we're talking about a family, but it's very important to understand that everything we're asked to do, Christ will do for us. So you're going to ask, well, why does he even ask us to do his then? Because he wants you to participate. He wants you to be a part of it. And that's kind of the whole, if you remember back in the creation myth, or account, it's not a myth, but the creation account, one of the lies that the serpent, the devil, tells Eve is that God does not want you to become like him. That is kind of the ultimate lie that's told in the Old Testament, is that God does not want us to be like him. If you think in John, I think it's John 1, what does he say? We do not know what we'll become, but we know that when he comes, we will be like him, because we'll see him as he is. And this is why we're given missions in the church. This is why we're offered the chance to make sacrifices, why we receive the baptismal priesthood, is so we can be like God. Okay. I just lost the point. Okay, it's back. So that's how it goes sometimes. So just kind of maybe summarize a little bit. I know I've maybe been kind of all over the place, but when we talk about what is God's role in the family, I haven't been very practical yet, and hopefully it'll be a little more when we get to the example, but God's role in the family is essential. There is no family, in one sense, without God. But God's role in the family is both one that of kind of descent. He comes into the family. He makes himself present in the family. Even the gift of a child is, that's a direct act of God in the life of a married couple. The child is a gift directly from God. And it's a way that the parents themselves participate in the creation, the creating act of God. But God's role is also one of ascent. He also takes the family into himself. So there's this kind of double act, and we see that on the cross as well. Jesus descends into human misery to make humanity ascend into his divine life. The church fathers were very fond of saying, God became man that man might become God. The family is a direct depiction of that. Depiction because it's an image of that very movement of love that goes down to bring up. And if you think about it, parents have to kind of go down to the level of their children. They can't just hover above them like some kind of, rise up to my level and then we'll talk. They have to kind of meet their children where they are and then bring them up. And if they refuse to do that, then they do fail in their role as parents. But they do have, they have the grace to do it and are no way alone in it. Okay, I don't know. Okay, I've been talking for a while. I want to go on to this quote. I think many of you know it. And controversial Catholic. We'll just get the whole quote. It's from Ephesians 5, and it's probably one of the most controversial quotes in the New Testament, and one that irks most people today. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, that she, the church, might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So this is the challenge part that I mentioned earlier in the beginning, and I do kind of, maybe just for the sake of some audience participation here, if there's anything here that really stands out. So if you have something where you kind of, I don't understand that part, or that is very difficult to interpret, I would love to hear it. But in either way, I will give some interpretive key to this. But you can take a minute to kind of read it on your own. Yeah, you don't think husbands get off easy with yeah. That's good. Yeah, it shouldn't be, but it might be. Does anyone else have some thoughts or points that are?
I think the only thing that's controversial is the husband is the head of the wife, which nobody likes to be subservient to anyone, but then if you read further on, like Jeffrey saying, it's a give and take kind of situation, like a team. So that's exactly what it is. The mother says that the woman is the neck, so it holds up and controls the head anyway. I think people just get stuck in that one point.
Yeah.
Don't read further on.
Yeah. Well, it's good points. I mean, one thing that struck me as I was kind of reading this and preparing this, that the very first sentence says, be subject to one another. So I think you're right when you say that what kind of, it's a little like, what's going on here is that the husband is the head of the wife. That's a little like, that doesn't sound, what does that mean? What it does point to, and this might be very controversial today, I'm glad that there's not really anyone here who is like struck by controversy and wants to leave the room when we read this. But what it does show, and you pointed at that as well, is that there are roles between man and wife, husband and wife. It's not roles in the sense that the woman is supposed to be at home and be the one who takes care of the children and the husband goes out to work. It's not those kind of roles, but there is a specific relationship that's proper to husband and wife. Be subject to one another is the first line, but the way a husband subjects to his wife is not the same way that a wife subjects herself to the husband. And I think you got it right on when you said, it says, wives, respect your husbands, but it says, husbands, love your wives. It's not the same word, and it's not equal in a sense. It's not unequal in the sense that one is better than the other, or one has to do more or has to decide more. But there is a different relationship going on. A quick point that I do want to make is that this word subject and submission, the Greek word does not really have the connotation that the English word have. Submission is something that kind of makes it sound like there's some kind of like, I want to do something, but he says no, so I submit. I let go of what I want to do myself, and now I have to. So it kind of bears this like I lose my freedom kind of sense. But Paul uses the same word when he talks about how Jesus will subject everything to the Father. And Jesus is not unequal to the Father. He's not less free because he subjects everything to the Father. And he is not being dominated by the Father because he does this. And it's the very same Greek word that Paul uses in both this sense and then when he talks about Jesus. So the Greek word does not carry that kind of, I'm a slave or I'm somehow being dominated by someone else. That's completely missing from the original Greek, but translation does sometimes obscure a little bit. But we'll just stay on it. But it's also worth pointing out here, because I've mentioned now that there's a different relationship between, or there's the way the husband relates to the wife is not the same as how the wife relates to the husband. Paul is not saying that the relationship between Christ and the church is akin to that relationship between husband and wife. He's saying the relationship between husband and wife should be like the relationship between Christ and the church. It's important to understand, like, where is this kind of movement in this passage going? Paul is pointing kind of upwards and pointing to what has Christ done for the church. Similarly, the husband should do for his wife. Yeah, so the great mystery that Paul is referring to is that mystery of Christ and the church. And I think I want to share a quote, because there's a man from the 5th century, I think it's the 5th, maybe the 4th, who can say it a lot better than I can. John Chrysostom, if you're familiar with him. Fun fact, Chrysostom means golden mouth in Greek, and he was given that subtitle because he was such an eloquent preacher. So he talks about this passage exactly, and he talks about how does wife and man relate to each other, or wife and husband. He says, pay attention to love's high standard. If you take the premise that your wife should submit to you as the church submits to Christ, then you should also take the same kind of careful, sacrificial thought for her that Christ takes for the church. Even if you must offer your own life for her, you must not refuse. Even if you must undergo countless struggles on her behalf and have all kinds of things to endure and suffer, you must not refuse. Even if you suffer all this, you have still not done as much as Christ has for the church. For you are already married when you act this way, whereas Christ is acting for one who has rejected and hated him. So just as he, when she was rejecting, hating, spurning, and nagging him, brought her to trust him by his great solicitude, not by threatening, lording it over her, or intimidating her, or anything like that, so you must also act toward your wife. Even if you see her looking down on you, nagging and despising you, you will be able to win her over with your great love and affection for her. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's very clear that if anything in this passage, it would be the husband who's given kind of the rough passage. Because if you look at the scene of the cross, if we take Mary as a figure of the church, and then you have Jesus, and I ask you, who's off worse? Yeah, okay. But Mary, we know, participates fully in the suffering of Christ. And that's what's very important here, is that, yes, the man does have something of the role of a leader in the family. We can't get around that. But it's very clear that this role of leadership is not given so that he can make the decisions as he sees fit. He's given that leadership role so he can make decisions for his family, for his wife and children, the church. Christ is not on the cross just for his own sake. He's there for the church. And as soon, if the husband in any way starts saying, I'm going to do this because I want to, or you will obey me because I say so, and you can see it here, he's acting directly contrary to what he's instructed to. So, I think I had a point, but I lost it again. It's not easy sometimes. Yeah, okay, so it's just, yeah, I think personally this is one of the most beautiful passages, because what it does help us to see is that to live a good married life, to live it as you should, there should be a very, very close intimacy with God himself and also with the church. I think maybe another aspect of this that can sound hard, or maybe seem like man and woman is not quite put on the same level, is that man here is kind of compared to Christ, who's perfect and good and everything, and the wife is compared to the church. And if we see a lot of things going on in the church today, and we might kind of say, is that really, are they really put on equal footing? Is that really fair? And I mean, if it wasn't for the cross, that would be true, because if Christ hadn't kind of put himself beneath the church to raise her up, then we would have a very unequal footing. But we don't, because Christ has died on the cross. I think it also says a lot about human dignity itself, because if the church represents all of humanity and woman represents the church, then the woman represents indirectly all of humanity. If we say there's some kind of like woman is worth less or is not as good as the man because of this passage, we don't understand the dignity of humanity, because the dignity of humanity is raised to the dignity of God because Christ became man. I know it's getting very kind of big and maybe very far away from what does this have to do with family life. But I think for me, because answering the question, what is God's role in the family? God's role in the family is everything. The family does not make sense without God. And I think a lot of the struggles we have are because we try and separate family and God, whereas they should be brought together as much as possible. Okay, I promised I would say something about St. Louis and Zelli. Many of you probably know who they are already. They're most famous just as the parents of Thérèse of Lisieux. I mean, that's a good thing to be famous for, but they are the first and only married couple to be canonized together. There are other married couples where both have been canonized, but they weren't canonized because of their married life. They were canonized because maybe they were martyred or something else like that. Saints Louis and Zelli lived a married life and were canonized together because of the holiness of their married life. Both Louis and Célie wanted to be religious, and they were both sent away. Louis, he was rejected because he didn't know Latin, and that was very important at the time. I don't quite remember why Célie was rejected, but she was also told that she could not enter religious life by a community. And so both of them were a little bit, okay, well, what should we do then? And then they met each other. I think it was in the city of Le Buisson, and they decided to get married. And then for the first time, for the first couple of months, maybe even a year, they tried to live what's called a Josephine marriage, and this means not to have children. And that's not, it can sound like, wait, doesn't that go completely against what the church says about marriage, that you have to be open to children? You do have to be open to children, but there is such a thing as entering into the spousal bond without the consummation of the marriage. That means it can still be dissolved, but it's nonetheless still a valid union. It's kind of a gray area. But anyway, they decided to try their hands at this. Mostly it was Louis who wanted to do this. Célie definitely wanted children. And eventually the parish priest came and he kind of sat them down and said, listen, this is not the point of married life. And he convinced Louis that this has to go, you have to try your hand at children. Altogether, they had 9 children, so they definitely took their part. But 4 of them died very young. I think, if I remember correctly, it was 4 sons, and then one of the sisters died very early. I forgot her name now. But they had, I believe it was 4 living daughters who grew up and everything. And it was Marie, Pauline, Céline. Oh no, they had 5 because there's Leonie and then Therese. So they had a lot of children. And we see that they were very, very solicitous about bringing God into the family. Louis would go to the 6 a.m. Mass every morning with the oldest daughters. I don't think I met anyone who does that. But he would do that every morning. They did everything they could to kind of prevent like worldly misunderstandings and confusion to kind of seep into the family. And then Célie was extremely dedicated to teaching her children how to pray. What is Marian devotion? Why do we have Marian devotion? I mean, the typical stuff. And we see it bearing fruit. The Martin family is a little bit extreme, maybe, because all 5 daughters became religious nuns. But it does show what happens when the family does live a life together, very closely united to God. They are a very ideal example. I mean, they're holy because of it. But they are something we should definitely learn from them in this respect, because they do show that there are many, like all of these challenges that we face, yes, we can overcome them, and it is possible to have a holy life in the family. Sadly, I think there is still something of an expectation that holiness is more for priests and or religious or something like that. I think it's definitely been combated because the Second Vatican Council really tried to make it clear. But Saints Louis and Célie kind of show there is a way to do this, and it's a way through just the ordinary events of family life. One element, for instance, is that Louis closed his shop every Sunday, despite friends and other people saying, like, but you could earn a lot of money. He was a craftsman, made watches and other fine things like that. And, they're telling him you could earn a lot of money if you open on Sunday, because there are a lot of customers about in the city who might, say, oh, wow, let's go in and have a look. He refused to keep the Sunday holy. And that's something you could easily imagine the struggle in someone's mind, like, oh, but yeah, we do need money for the family. And it's not, they were well off. I mean, they were in extreme poverty, but more money wouldn't have hurt. Um, but still, keeping that kind of sacrifice in order to kind of show his children how we're supposed to do this. He would also let his children like participate in a lot of what he was doing to show them. For instance, he entrusted most of the alms he gave, he entrusted it to Therese. So he would give her the money and say, you go and give it. And so she would run up and give alms to the poor people or whatever they might encountered. I can only really just recommend reading as much about them as possible if you live in family life or aspire to live a family life. They're definitely worth knowing. And I mean, I don't know if they're necessarily the patron saints of family life. I think Mary and Joseph take that crown, but they are still very important in that regard. Okay, I promised I would say something about a different kind of example. This picture is of the Samaritan woman, or the woman at the well. And I mean, I chose that because it's a good example of how Jesus will enter into someone's life despite their family situation maybe not being ideal. And I mean, the Samaritan woman has been married 5 times and is living with another man who's not her husband. But it's just to make the connection clear. But what I wanted to mention was just a little bit about the example of my own family. So I've talked a lot about what the ideal should be. My parents were never married in the eyes of the church. They were married civilly. So already there, okay, we're far away from the ideal now. Then they got divorced, again civilly, but they got divorced when I was around 2 years old. So, okay, never really married in the first place. Then they got divorced, so we're kind of even further away now. And then, lived separate lives and all this. So you could argue that the foundation is not that good. How is God going to enter into this? Well, he's not a God who just stays away if things are not perfect. My dad is a Catholic still. He wasn't, he still is. And then he took upon himself to try and practice the faith as best as he could, be an example as best as he could given the circumstances. And I mean, I can't relate all of my life to you now, but growing up, that became kind of the way God would enter into the family. Because God doesn't need, the doors being wide open and a procession and everything for him to enter. If the door is just kind of cracked open, he will come, he will enter. And I mean, I didn't become Catholic until I was 18 years old because I did have my kind of bend and kind of turned away from the church because it didn't make sense at that time, but eventually brought back. And today, I'm the youngest of 3, but today my oldest brother is about to be ordained a priest and has also had his time outside the church and a big conversion. And he's the only one to be ordained from the diocese. It's the Diocese of Copenhagen in Denmark, Europe. But he's the only one. And so, I mean, if anything, that's a testament to that, yeah, God will intercede and God will do great things, even if the ideal is not, fulfilled or lived out. I mostly wanted to share some of this. I mean, yeah, I'm here too, and my other brother is on the path to married life. But I wanted to share it just because when we talk about the ideal of family life, it is easy to maybe get swept up in all these things that it should be, and then feel maybe kind of, well, is my family really that, or am I trying my hardest in all these different aspects? And just to kind of say, well, God will still be present, even if everything's not, perfectly tailored to how he has wished for it to be in the beginning. God does not abandon anyone. So maybe with that note, we can go to a slight Q&A. I hope I've answered the question somewhat. I don't think I paced myself very well. I talked more than I intended, but okay, here we are. So if there is a Q&A, if you have any questions or anything in any regard, Q&A. I don't know if I wanted it more than other people, but I think the tension between a world without God and a world with God was definitely brought to my attention from a very early age, because I had one parent who said God is not real, and I had another parent who said God is real. So I kind of grew up in that tension, and the parents do have an enormous weight in how we relate to God. And so for me, because there was just that tension immediately, pretty much as long as I can remember, it became an important question for me to figure out. So who's right? Like, which parent got it right here? Is God real or is he not? And so, I mean, you might say that the less ideal situation became one that God used to kind of spur me on to seek truth, which is a very important aspect. But if I decide holiness more, or if that's hard to say, because there are, I mean, Therese, for instance, had the perfect family, kinda, and she decided holiness and was willing to sacrifice much more than I have done. But I do think that, I mean, looking back at it, that it's an example of God using something that's not perfect, that's not ideal, and then using that to create something that's good or lead someone in the path of good. Because there's a big point to remember that Jesus himself says, "I came to call sinners, not the just." I don't know if that's answered your question, or I could say more, but if there are any other questions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think I get the question. Yeah, I mean, again, a full discourse could be presented on divorce, but in terms of, I mean, marriage is until death does apart. So if one spouse dies, then the other one is not married anymore. But that is kind of the only way for marriage to end, is with the death of either both or one spouse. In the Old Testament, there is different kind of rules laid out. Divorce is allowed for in the Old Testament, but Jesus does testify that that's because of the hardness of man's heart. You can kind of see that men in that time probably had a fairly hard time just being faithful to one woman. With a lot of the kings of the Old Testament practice polygamy and other things. And as soon as Jesus says that there is no such thing as divorce, his disciples say, well, then it's better not to get married. So it does seem like they did have a hard time, and there was many different kind of interpretations, because it says if a woman is unsatisfactory to her husband, he's allowed to divorce her. And that was interpreted very, very widely. Some rabbis says that means if she's unfaithful, adultery, then he can. Others said if she burns your food, you can divorce her. It's kind of that spectrum we were on. But I can't say what divorce looks like in God's eyes, because God is the only one who has kind of the insight into what caused the divorce. For instance, in my parents' case, because they weren't married in the sense of what the church says is married, they didn't commit the sin of divorce. If anything, it was a good thing that they separated, because their union was not in accordance with God's will. So, I mean, it can get very kind of, okay, but was the marriage valid to begin with, and then what happened? If it is a valid marriage, then the divorce would be, it would be breaking a vow, and then it would be going directly against what God has ordained. He will never be, happy with that. We can say that much. But he will never forsake either of the partners. But that said, if you do divorce and remarry, you are effectively excluded from the sacramental life of the church. What does that mean? You can't receive sacramental absolution, which means if you go to confession, the priest can't forgive you. He can do the motions, but it won't work. You can't receive communion either. And it's because the communion in the church that you have entered into is through your marriage life, through your married life. So if you separate yourself from that, you separate yourself from the rest of the church as well. If you remarry, you can be physically separated for good reasons. There might be, any number of reasons for why the spouses will not live together. Divorce is, as I said, I can't speak on behalf of God what it looks like in his eyes. But it is important to understand that from the very beginning, God had wanted man and woman to be together, and that it is sin that has kind of ruptured that union. Because even religious life exists as a way to overcome the disorderedness, our tendency to sin, is a way to kind of radically challenge that. But the what's kind of proper to human nature is married life. So to finish, divorce does it makes a statement somehow on the nature of humankind, and then on nature of God as well. So it's very intimate, and it is, it's a serious matter. But as I said, God will never kind of just abandon someone. Okay. Yeah, brother. A few years until that title. Yeah. Again, it's one of those. If you ever meet a canon lawyer and ask him what do you work with most of the time, it's annulment cases, And it is because there's so many factors to consider in this. To make maybe the shortest answer, let's say two people got married and they have children and everything, but then one partner suddenly reveals that they never intended for this to last for life. Okay, the children are not to blame for anything in this. The one partner who did enter into married life with the intention of it remaining forever has not committed any fault. But then there's the decision that, okay, yes, we could have the marriage annulled under these circumstances. Do we choose to do so? Because they don't have to. It's not like they can still choose to go forward with it, and the church, there's no problem. It's not sin. It's not, because as long as the one partner hasn't acted against it, like if she hasn't been unfaithful or something like that, they don't have to do anything. And even if she had, or he had, they don't have to get annulled. But annulments often create a situation where we can say someone is innocently ignorant. And if someone is innocently ignorant, they're not culpable of guilt. And so an annulment okay, some circumstance that wasn't known is now known. What do we do with that? I think that's the shortest answer, but it does get very tricky. Yeah, I mean, I've only illuminated one aspect, and it's been a very kind of doctrinal and like very much with how does marriage relate to God. You could talk so much about just married life in itself and how does that relate to each other. But thank you for listening, and I can hear thank you.